For 480 days, on a ridge scarred by wildfire, a mountain lion lived like a ghost. No roar, no hunt, no purpose left. But on one freezing afternoon, everything changed when he heard a faint cry drifting through the snow. A tiny sound, one that stirred a heart he thought had died long ago. For nearly a year and a half, the high country of the Sierra Nevada carried the rumor of a shadow, an animal so quiet that even the wind seemed louder than his heartbeat. Locals called him Ridge, a name the rangers used when they needed to explain the strange tracks that appeared after storms or the deer carcasses stripped with surgical precision. But to those who had tried to study him, Ridge was something else entirely. A mountain lion who no longer behaved like a living creature. He moved like a ghost, drifting from canyon to canyon, never claiming territory, never growling, never answering the calls of other cougars echoing across the ridges. Everything changed for him the night the wildfire swept through Dry Pines Gorge. The flames had come fast, too fast for Ridge to save the mate he'd hunted with for 3 seasons, or the newborn cubs he had only seen once. When the smoke finally cleared, the nest of boulders that held his family was nothing but ash and twisted brush. Ridge walked through it without a sound, breathing in the scent of loss until it carved itself permanently into his bones. After that, he stopped making noise altogether. He moved through the wilderness like a mute shadow. No growl, no warning rumble, not even a frustrated huff during the lean winter months. In the 480 days that followed, Ridge avoided everything that reminded him of what he had lost. He passed up kills because the smell of warm meat reminded him of the meals he used to bring home. He slept on bare stone in an abandoned fire lookout, ignoring the deep caves he once preferred. Even the rangers who monitored wildlife activity, men and women trained in tracking, conservation, and even specialized fields like wildlife insurance logistics, struggled to understand his behavior. A healthy adult cougar should have been claiming land, hunting regularly, pushing out younger males. But Ridge was doing none of that. It was as if the fire had burned out the part of him that cared whether he lived or died. February arrived with sharp winds cutting down from the crest line. The sun sank early behind the granite peaks, leaving blue shadows stretching across the forest floor. Ridge trudged along a narrow spine of rock he had walked 1,000 times before, guided only by instinct and the faint memory of safety. He paused near the entrance of an old mining shaft, the closest thing he had to shelter now, and lifted his head to test the air. That was when he smelled it. A scent so fragile that, at first, Ridge thought he imagined it. It wasn't deer or rabbit or fox, not coyote, not bear, not any predator or prey that belonged to the Sierra. The smell was delicate, faintly sweet, carrying the warmth of milk and the cold tang of fear. It was the scent of a baby, but not one from these mountains. Ridge lowered his massive body closer to the ground, every muscle tightening with slow, deliberate control. He followed the smell to a cluster of rocks just outside the mining shaft. Snow had drifted against the stones, but there, pressed into the thin crust, were footprints so tiny he had to blink to make sure they were real. They looked almost like the tracks of a bobcat kitten, but smaller, lighter, too delicate for any wild-born creature to survive here alone. Ridge stepped closer, nose brushing the prints. The scent pulsed through him again, cold, frightened, foreign. Something was out there, struggling in a world that would never show mercy. For a moment, Ridge felt a strange tug in his chest, an ache deep in the place where memory lived. It had been 480 days since anything had pierced the numbness he wore like a second skin. A gust of icy wind swept across the ridge, carrying with it a faint, high-pitched cry. Not the sound of a coyote pup, not a bobcat, something smaller, something fragile. A sound that had no business echoing across a mountain known for predators. Ridge lifted his head sharply. The cry came again, thin, weak, muffled by snow. And for the first time in 480 days, the ghost of Sierra Ridge moved with purpose. He turned toward the sound, his paws pressing firm into the snow, his tail sweeping low, his body alive with a strange electricity he hadn't felt since before the fire. Instinct told him this was none of his concern, that the mountains did not forgive foolishness, that he should retreat into the mining shaft and wait out the storm moving in from the north. But another feeling rose stronger, something older, deeper, the same instinct that once drove him to curl around his newborn cubs in a nest of warm leaves. Ridge took another step toward the sound, then another. The wind shifted, and the faint cry of the lost kitten trembled across the ridge once more. The cry grew clearer as Ridge descended the narrow slope, each step measured against the freezing crust of late winter snow. The storm clouds gathering above the Sierra Nevada pressed low and heavy, the kind that swallowed light and sound until the world felt like a sealed chamber of ice. Ridge moved with the same silent precision that had made him a ghost to rangers and hikers alike. But inside, something restless had begun to stir. The fragile scent he'd followed cut through memories he had buried under months of silence. Memories of warmth, of tiny bodies pressed beneath his chest, of nights when he had kept watch instead of wandering alone. He slowed near a cluster of fallen pines, their trunks blackened from the wildfire that had erased the life he once knew. The cry came again, trembling and thin, rising from somewhere just beyond the splintered wood. Ridge lowered his head and pushed through the branches, his breath forming white plumes in the freezing air. The scent grew stronger now. Milk, fear, and something else. The unmistakable trace of humans. Not fresh, not recent, but present enough to make Ridge's muscles stiffen. He had learned long ago that anything touched by people usually meant danger. Even rangers trying to provide wildlife protection could bring trouble for a cougar who wandered too close. But then he saw it. Curled against the trunk of a pine stump was a kitten so small, Ridge wondered how it had survived even one night out here. Its fur was pale gray, tipped with frost, and its tiny sides fluttered with shallow breaths. Snowflakes clung to its whiskers as it lifted its head, blinking at Ridge with eyes too big for its narrow face. When it tried to meow, the sound barely rose above a whisper. The kitten couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 weeks old, far too young to survive the backcountry. A domestic kitten, not a wild-born creature. Something that should have been curled beside a fireplace, not shivering in a storm on the mountain. Ridge inhaled again, confused. The faint trace of human scent on the kitten's fur suggested it hadn't escaped from the wilderness itself. Maybe it had fallen from a car stopping at an overlook, or wandered too far from a campground before the winter closure. Or worse, someone had abandoned it here thinking the mountains could give it a chance. The kitten tried to stand, but collapsed into the snow, its little paws trembling violently. It stared at Ridge with no understanding of what he was. No fear, no instinct to run, only the desperate hope that anything larger and warmer might mean safety. A sudden gust swept across the ridge, carrying with it a new sound, an eerie, broken howl. Coyote. Ridge's ears snapped forward. Another howl replied from farther down the slope, followed by the scratchy chorus of more voices. A small group, hungry, winter-starved, drawn by the same scent Ridge had followed. The kitten heard it too. It tried to crawl deeper beneath the pine stump, but its legs buckled again. Ridge stepped closer, his shadow falling across the tiny creature. He wasn't sure what he intended. Part of him whispered that he should leave it. This mountain didn't forgive weakness. Every instinct a predator possessed told him that. But something deeper, something older, anchored his paws in the snow. He remembered the weight of his lost cubs resting against his belly. He remembered the helpless squeaks they made before the fire took them away. The first coyote appeared between the trees, a rangy, gray-coated male, ribs sharp beneath his winter fur. It saw Ridge and froze, head lowering in a warning stance. Two more shapes flickered behind it, their eyes glinting in the dimming light. They wanted the kitten, but they knew Ridge could kill them all if he wanted to. Ridge didn't snarl, he didn't roar, but he stepped fully between the kitten and the coyotes, shoulders rising, tail low, muscles gathering into the coiled strength of a mountain lion who had nothing left to lose. The coyotes hesitated. One barked, another growled, but they didn't advance. Ridge held his ground until the wind shifted and the pack realized the risk wasn't worth the meal. One by one, they slunk back into the trees, their hunger swallowed by caution. When their howls faded, Ridge turned. The kitten had collapsed completely now, its tiny body shaking with cold. Snow gathered along its back like powdered glass. Ridge lowered his head, inhaling softly. The kitten's heartbeat was faint but present. It blinked up at him, eyes unfocused, and let out a weak, rasping cry that sounded like a plea more than a sound. Ridge did something he had not done for 480 days. He made a choice for someone other than himself. He lowered his chest to the snow and nudged the kitten gently toward the shelter of the fallen pines. The little body rolled closer to him, drawn by warmth. Ridge curled one massive foreleg around the small life at his feet, creating a pocket of heat against the wind. The kitten pressed its face into the thick fur of his leg, finally stilling. Above them, the first flakes of the storm began to fall. Thick, heavy, the kind that signaled danger even to humans who understood weather patterns and outdoor safety. Ridge lifted his head toward the sky, feeling the air pressure shift. If he stayed here, both of them would freeze. He needed shelter, real shelter. Somewhere close, somewhere safe. Ridge rose carefully, lifting the kitten with the soft pressure of his chin until it rested against his chest. It didn't resist. It didn't even meow. It simply clung to life in the only warmth the mountain offered it. With slow, deliberate steps, Ridge turned back toward the old mining shaft he had long abandoned. He had never expected to return there. But tonight, the mountain demanded something different of him. And for reasons he could not yet understand, he obeyed. The storm swallowed the ridge behind him as he carried the lost kitten into the gathering dark. Ridge reached the mouth of the abandoned mining shaft just as the storm tightened around the mountain, sweeping the ridge with sheets of snow sharp enough to sting his eyes. The shaft wasn't warm, but it was sheltered, its wooden beams still standing from a century-old operation, its stone walls deep enough to hold back the wind. Ridge lowered the trembling kitten onto a patch of dry soil near the inner wall. The little creature tried to stand, but its legs folded beneath it like wet paper. Its head dropped, eyes half closed, breathing shallow. Ridge watched it for a long moment, trying to understand why he hadn't walked away. For most of the 480 days since the wildfire, he had lived like a drifting shadow, taking only what he needed, giving nothing, avoiding anything that stirred memory. But this kitten, no bigger than the rabbits he sometimes ignored, had somehow pushed through the numbness. Fear radiated off its body like heat. Yet it looked toward him with the stunned trust of something too young to know predators. The storm's wind howled outside the shaft, rattling the rotten wooden beams. Ridge felt the cold creep past the entrance and knew the kitten wouldn't last the night unless he acted. Its sides were barely lifting with each breath. The faint trace of human scent was fading, replaced by the sour smell of fever. Ridge lowered his nose and exhaled gently across the kitten's fur, feeling the heat beneath, not the warmth of life. This heat was different. Illness, dehydration, a body running out of time. The kitten tried to meow, but the sound was broken, like a twig snapping under snow. Ridge backed away a few steps, torn between instinct and something he couldn't name. He should leave. A sick creature was a liability in the wild. Even humans, with all their medical insurance, emergency clinics, and shelters, understood how fragile a young life could be in weather like this. But Ridge had already broken one instinct tonight by choosing to stand between the kitten and the coyotes. And now another instinct, older, deeper, began to rise from where he had buried it, the instinct to protect. He stepped forward again, curling his body around the kitten without touching it. His warmth spread slowly across the small space. The kitten blinked once, twice, then lifted its tiny head toward Ridge's chest. It dragged itself forward inch by inch until its body pressed into the thick fur along his foreleg. Ridge stiffened. No creature had dared come this close since the day he lost everything in the fire. But the kitten's shivering eased as the warmth enveloped it, and Ridge felt the faint, irregular pulse against his leg. So fragile, so alive. Snow hammered the entrance, piling up in a curtain of white. Ridge knew he needed to hunt. The kitten needed food, but not raw meat. It wouldn't survive it in this state. It needed moisture, warmth, something gentle on a stomach that empty. Ridge rose slowly and padded to the mouth of the shaft. The storm stung his face as he pushed into it. This kind of weather could kill an adult deer, let alone a kitten. He moved into the wind, keeping his body low, scanning for anything, stream, puddle, even melting snow he could heat by carrying back against his fur. He found it near a cluster of boulders, a small trickle of water that hadn't frozen yet. Shielded by overhanging stone, Ridge dipped his paw, lifted a small amount onto his fur, and let the warmth of his body heat it. He returned to the shaft and lowered his chest beside the kitten, letting droplets roll onto its tiny mouth. The kitten licked weakly, too tired to lift its head. Ridge repeated the process over and over, even as the storm deepened. By the third trip, the kitten's breathing strengthened just enough for its tail to twitch when Ridge approached. The tiny movement startled him. It was the smallest sign of life, yet it hit him with the weight of an avalanche. Because it had been 480 days since he had cared whether another creature lived or died. Ridge settled beside the kitten again, lowering his body like a shield against the cold. Outside, the storm battered the mountain, burying the world in silence. Inside the shaft, only 2 breaths filled the air. One deep and steady, one faint but stubborn. Ridge watched the kitten through the long hours of the night, listening to the wind clawing at the rocks, knowing he had crossed a line he could never uncross. Something inside him had cracked open, letting in a sliver of the warmth he thought the wildfire had taken forever. By morning, the storm had eased, leaving the world covered in a thick blanket of new snow. The kitten stirred first, lifting its head with effort, its eyes clearer than they had been the night before. It let out a soft, rasping sound and nudged Ridge's leg with the smallest gesture of trust. Ridge lowered his head, touching the top of the kitten's fur with a careful, uncertain breath. A decision had been made, one that would change everything still ahead. By the time the gray light of morning pushed through the cracks of the mining shaft, the storm had swallowed the entire ridge. Snowdrifts piled high against the entrance, narrowing it into a small, jagged opening that breathed cold air into the shelter, like the lungs of the mountain itself. Ridge stood at the threshold for a long moment, watching the white wind sweep past in relentless sheets. It wasn't just a winter storm. This was one of those rare Sierra squalls that rolled down from the high passes and froze everything in its path. Even the trees on the slope groaned under the weight of the ice forming on their branches. Behind Ridge, the kitten, Ash, as he would come to be known, let out a soft, muffled cry. It wasn't the frightened sound from the night before. This one was weaker, more strained, edged with the dry rasp of fever. Ash's small body trembled in irregular waves, as if every breath demanded more strength than he had left. Ridge turned and lowered himself beside the kitten, but even his warmth couldn't soothe the violent shivers running through Ash's spine. The storm had bought them safety from the coyotes, but it had brought a new danger: dehydration. Fever clawed away at a young body faster than hunger ever could. Ridge understood this on instinct alone. The kitten needed water, warm water, not snow that would only chill him further. He needed something humans would describe as basic care, the kind they talk about when discussing good health insurance or emergency pet clinics. But here on the mountain, there were no clinics, no safety nets, only Ridge. He stood again and pressed his nose against the icy wind pouring through the narrow entrance. He hated leaving the shaft, hated the thought of turning his back on something so small and helpless. Yet if he stayed, Ash would not survive the day. Ridge dug his paw into the snow, widening the opening enough to slip through. The cold bit into his paws immediately. He stepped out anyway. The world outside had disappeared beneath a thick white blanket. Snow whipped sideways, blurring trees and boulders into ghostly shapes. Ridge hunched low, fighting the wind as he made his way toward the rocky outcrop where he remembered seeing a trickle of water the day before. It felt impossibly far now. Each step was a struggle, the snow sinking nearly to his belly, his whiskers freezing stiff from the cold. The wind roared like a living thing. But Ridge kept going, because behind him, a heartbeat no bigger than a pine cone depended on him. He found the water by scent alone. Beneath a tilted slab of granite, a narrow stream had avoided freezing completely, fed by a spring deeper beneath the mountain. Ridge lowered his head and dipped his paw into the shallow flow. The shock of cold numbed his toes instantly. Carefully, he lifted his paw, letting droplets cling to his fur as he turned back toward the shaft. The return was harder. The storm blew so fiercely that it erased his paw prints behind him, leaving no trail. Ridge moved by memory, relying on familiar contours in the rocky slope. When he finally slipped back into the mining shaft, the warmth of the enclosed space brushed his fur like a soft sigh. Ash lay curled in the same spot, his breath shallow. Ridge lowered himself, angling his paw so that warm drops of water rolled down onto Ash's tiny mouth. The kitten's tongue twitched, then flicked upward weakly. Ridge repeated the process again and again, each journey into the storm longer than the last. On his fourth trip back, Ash managed to lift his head for a brief moment. A faint spark flickered in those huge gray-blue eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or trust. But the mountain wasn't finished with them. A sudden rush of air swept down the shaft entrance, carrying a shadow that moved too smoothly to be wind. Ridge's ears snapped forward. High above the opening, circling against the storm-light sky, a golden eagle pivoted sharply in the air. Its wings cut through the wind with terrifying precision. It had likely spotted Ridge earlier, or worse, seen the small, helpless shape of Ash against the dark earth inside the shaft. The eagle folded its wings and dove. Ridge lunged toward the entrance just as the eagle's talons scraped against the stones. Its wings beat furiously, scattering snow in violent bursts. Ash let out a shrill, terrified cry. Ridge's body moved before his mind made sense of the danger. He reared up, striking one massive paw across the narrow opening. His claws slashed through air just inches from the eagle's chest, forcing it to veer sideways and crash against the snowbank. The eagle recovered fast, faster than Ridge expected. It lunged again, its beak snapping, talons reaching. Ridge threw his weight toward the entrance, sealing the opening with his body and his fury. He released a deep, rumbling sound, the first real sound he had made in 480 days. It wasn't quite a roar, but it was enough. The eagle hesitated. Ridge lowered his head, ears pinned back, and bared his teeth in a silent warning powerful enough to shake the air inside the shaft. The eagle lifted off, angry and frustrated, disappearing into the storm with a single sweep of its wings. Ridge remained at the entrance for a long moment, chest rising and falling as the wind pressed against him. Only when he was certain the predator was gone did he turn back toward Ash. The kitten had crawled only an inch from where Ridge left him, too weak to move farther. But his eyes were wide now, alert, frightened, and fixed completely on Ridge. The mountain lion stepped toward him, lowering his head until their noses almost touched. Ash let out a tiny breathy sound, something between a whimper and a sigh, then pressed his face into Ridge's foreleg once again. Outside, the storm raged on, threatening to bury the shaft entirely. But inside, Ridge curled protectively around the kitten, anchoring him with the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He didn't know why he was doing this. He only knew he wasn't willing to stop. By the third morning after the storm, the Ridge finally loosened its grip on winter. The sky brightened in uneven patches, light breaking through ragged clouds and scattering across the snow-covered valley. Ridge stepped outside the mining shaft for the first real time since the blizzard, stretching stiff muscles and testing the air. Ash, though still weak, was no longer fading. The kitten's breaths had steadied, and a faint purr, thin, shaky, vibrated in his chest whenever Ridge lay down beside him. It was the first sound of comfort Ridge had heard in 480 days. But the storm had left signs everywhere. Broken branches, deep drifts, and sharp trails carved by animals desperate for food. These marks drew the attention of men long before Ridge realized it. By midday, faint crunches carried across the slope, muffled by new snow but unmistakably human. Ridge lifted his head sharply, ears rotating. The sounds grew clearer. Boots, gear, quiet voices carried on the cold air. Rangers. Ridge slipped back into the shaft immediately, instinct propelling him to shield Ash. Human scent drifted toward them. Clean wool, metal tools, the smell of gasoline from snowmobiles on the lower trail. Ridge recognized these smells. He had skirted ranger patrols for years, staying invisible, avoiding anything that looked like roads, campsites, or the kind of human activity that led to traps and relocation. Humans didn't always mean danger, but danger always followed humans eventually. Ash tried to lift his head, startled by the unfamiliar voices outside. Ridge pressed his body against the kitten, silently urging him to stay down. The ranger's words floated through the entrance. Fragments about the storm, about tracking unusual prints, about checking for injured wildlife. One ranger mentioned insurance paperwork for damaged trail markers. Another spoke about rising predator activity near the backcountry line. Their voices were calm, routine, the way experienced hikers discuss safety or outdoor gear. But Ridge's muscles coiled tight anyway. A shadow crossed the shaft entrance, then another. Ridge crouched, lowering his body over Ash until his chest brushed the ground. Only his eyes moved, fixed on the silhouette stopping just feet from the opening. A beam of light swept across the snow, then angled into the shaft. Ash whimpered softly at the brightness, and Ridge felt the kitten's tiny body shake. "Hold on," one ranger said quietly. "I see something." Boots crunched closer. A gloved hand pushed aside the snow blocking the lower lip of the shaft. The flashlight beam widened, illuminating the cramped space. It landed first on Ash, small, pale, shivering. Then it slid upward across Ridge's massive shoulders, catching the amber glow of his eyes. Everything froze. Ridge didn't snarl. He didn't move. But the air changed instantly, charged with the ancient tension between predator and man. The ranger inhaled sharply. "Mountain lion," he whispered. "Big one." Another ranger stepped beside him. "And is that a kitten?" They didn't move any closer. They knew better than to provoke a cornered cougar. But the sight of a sick kitten in a frozen shaft was something they couldn't ignore. The older ranger spoke slowly, keeping his voice low. "Easy, boy. We're not here to hurt you. We just need to get the little one out of the cold." Ridge didn't understand the words, but he understood the intention the way all wild creatures do. Humans wanted the kitten. They always took what didn't belong to them, even if they believed they were helping. The second ranger set down a soft carrier on the snow, unzipping it carefully. The sound echoed sharply. Ash meowed suddenly, a small, frightened sound, and struggled to bury himself beneath Ridge's leg. Ridge shifted, lowering his head to block the ranger's view. His tail swept the ground in a slow, deliberate warning. "We can't leave it," the younger ranger insisted. "It'll die out here, and if he gestured subtly to Ridge, "gets hungry, he won't," the older ranger murmured, studying the cougar with quiet awe. "Look at how he's standing. He's guarding it." That truth, one no human expected, hung in the air like a fragile thread. But rules were rules, and a domestic animal alone in the wild had to be removed for its own safety. "All right," the older ranger said softly. "We do this slow, no sudden moves." They stepped forward only one pace. Ridge rose instantly, not attacking, not lunging, but standing tall enough that his head nearly brushed the shaft's low ceiling. His eyes locked onto the ranger's, steady, unblinking, full of a warning so clear no translator was needed. Both men froze. The younger ranger whispered, "We'll tranquilize him if we have to." The older ranger shook his head immediately. "No. Look at him. He'll fall on the kitten if we do." We wait for an opening. Ash's fever-weak cry pierced the silence. It broke Ridge in a way the rangers couldn't see. The thought of men taking the tiny creature away made something deep inside him twist painfully. Something that had been silent since the wildfire stole his world. Then it happened. Ash tried to stand, wavering, and stumbled forward, right into the flashlight beam. The younger ranger reached out instinctively, scooping the kitten with quick, practiced movements. Ridge surged forward, but the older ranger raised a hand sharply, stepping between them with surprising courage. "It's okay," he said. "Easy, boy, easy." Ash cried out as he was lifted, tiny paws reaching for the only warmth he knew. Ridge's chest vibrated with a low rumble, not a roar, not a snarl, but the sound of something breaking open after 480 days of silence. The rangers backed away slowly, Ash tucked against the younger man's jacket. Ridge stepped into the storm after them. For the first time in over a year, he let his voice fill the mountains. A deep, anguished cry that rolled through the pines and made the valley fall still. A sound no ranger had ever heard from him. A sound of loss. A sound of something he could not understand being ripped away. The rangers hurried down the slope, startled by the intensity behind them. Ridge followed as far as he dared, stopping only when the scent of gasoline and metal stung his senses. The world of humans began where his world ended. If he crossed the invisible line, he knew danger waited. Traps, tranquilizers, relocation, worse. But Ash's tiny cry, muffled inside the ranger's jacket, reached him one last time across the snow. And Ridge made a silent vow, one that would pull him into places no mountain lion should ever go. He would not lose another life he cared for. Ash's scent faded quickly as the rangers descended the lower ridge, swallowed by exhaust fumes and the metallic smell of the snowmobile they had left parked near the service road. Ridge followed as far as he could without stepping into the open trail, his paws sinking deep into the soft snow. The wind carried the kitten's faint cries for a while, thin, confused, frightened. Then even that disappeared. For a long moment, Ridge stood there, staring down at the dark line of the road where the rangers vanished. It was the same place he had avoided for years, ever since the wildfire and the men who came after. With their traps, their relocation trucks, and their plans written on clipboards. He had always stayed away from anything that smelled like human business. Insurance inspections after storms, winter patrol crews, even hikers who talked loudly about mortgage rates as they climbed the switchbacks. But now none of that mattered. Ash was gone, and the silence that Ridge had once used as armor now felt unbearable. He turned away only when the cold began biting into his paws. The storm had weakened, but the ridge was still slick with ice. Ridge moved with a quick, determined pace across the slope, circling toward the lower forest where the road leveled out. He didn't know exactly where the rangers had taken Ash. Humans always had structured paths, marked routes, and rules that animals did not understand. But he had something stronger than direction. He had scent, he had instinct, and he had the growing ache of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 480 days. Attachment. By dusk, Ridge reached the edge of the backcountry boundary, where a line of wooden posts and faded forest signs marked the beginning of human territory. Beyond it, the world smelled different. Rubber, diesel, chemicals used for road safety, and the faint sting of a nearby town where people lived in warmth behind glass windows. It was a place Ridge would normally avoid, a place where a mountain lion in the open could trigger phone calls to local authorities, or even an accident attorney if someone panicked and caused a crash while trying to avoid him. But tonight, Ridge refused to retreat. He moved low across the icy brush, following the narrow service road until he reached a cluster of ranger cabins built near the trailhead. Their windows glowed with soft yellow light. Ridge crouched behind a fallen log, breathing slowly, watching. The cabin doors opened and closed as rangers ended their shift, snow-soaked jackets hanging from their shoulders. Laughter carried through the cold air. One ranger murmured something about paperwork and the rising cost of winter maintenance. Another complained about his insurance deductible after hitting a fallen branch with a patrol truck. But Ridge's attention snapped to a different sound, a muffled mewling. His head lifted sharply. It came from the second cabin, the one with the slightly open curtain. Ridge crept closer, each step silent. Through the narrow gap in the window, he saw a small figure huddled inside a cardboard carrier on a table. A tiny gray kitten, wrapped in a towel, shivering under the soft glow of the cabin's heater. Ash. The sight sent a surge of heat through Ridge's chest. Ash lifted his head weakly, as if sensing the presence outside. The kitten let out a trembling cry, not loud, but desperate. Ridge pressed his paw into the frozen earth. If he entered the clearing, the humans would see him instantly. They'd tranquilize him, relocate him, or worse. His size alone made him a threat in their eyes. But then, just as Ridge contemplated retreating into the shadows, the door to the second cabin swung open. A young ranger stepped out, carrying a trash bag and muttering to himself about the cold. He walked only a few steps before slipping on the icy path, letting out a startled yell as he fell. The bag tore open, scattering paper cups and wrappers across the snow. The sudden noise startled Ash inside the cabin. The kitten panicked, scrambling against the sides of the cardboard carrier. Its tiny body flipped the container onto its side. The latch, hastily closed, popped open. Ash spilled out, stumbled across the table, and in his fevered confusion, leapt down to the floor with a thud loud enough for Ridge to hear from outside. The ranger, still picking up trash, didn't notice. But Ash bolted through the half-closed cabin door, straight into the clearing. The cold hit him instantly. His small legs skidded across the ice. The kitten meowed, frightened, disoriented, turning in circles as the freezing wind sliced through his fragile body. From the trees, Ridge stepped forward without hesitation. Ash saw him, and with the last bit of strength he had, the kitten ran, clumsy, slipping, straight toward the only creature who had kept him alive. Ridge's heart slammed against his ribs as he bounded into the clearing, closing the distance in seconds. But danger arrived just as fast. A stray dog, a rangy, half-wild animal wandering near the cabins, lunged from behind the generator shed, drawn by Ash's frantic cries. Its snarl cut through the cold like a knife. Ridge saw the dog's teeth flash in the dim light. Ash froze, terrified and cornered near an icy drop-off at the edge of the clearing. The dog sprang. Ridge hit the ground between them with explosive force. The collision cracked the air. Snow burst upward as the dog tumbled backward, skidding across the ice with a yelp. Ridge's roar, his first full roar in nearly 2 years, rolled across the clearing like thunder. The rangers inside the cabins froze. The dog scrambled to its feet and fled into the woods, tail tucked tightly between its legs. Ash collapsed trembling into the snow. Ridge lowered his head, nudging the kitten gently until Ash pressed into his chest, burying his face in Ridge's fur with a weak, relieved cry. Not a sound of fear, one of recognition, one of belonging. The cabin doors burst open behind them. Rangers shouted, flashlights cutting through the dark. Ridge stepped back into the tree line, Ash clinging desperately to his fur. The beams of light swept the trees, but Ridge was already gone, his powerful body melting into the forest, with the kitten tucked safely beneath him. He carried Ash all the way back to the ridge, back to the mountains, back to the place where their story had begun. When they reached the high overlook, snow glittering under the moonlight, Ridge set Ash down gently beside him. For the first time in 480 days, he lifted his head toward the open sky and released a long, deep call. Rich, resonant, alive. It echoed across the canyon, rolling through the pines, shaking loose the silence that had held him captive for so long. Ash curled against his paw, purring faintly. And high above the mountains of Sierra Nevada, the wind carried Ridge's voice farther than it ever had before. A voice that finally had something worth protecting again.